Hi, I'm Nazbanou Nozari from Carnegie Mellon University, and this is work done by my late friend, Akira Omaki. In English, verbs must agree with their subjects in plurality. We say the snake is, snakes are. Most speakers respect this rule most of the time. However, agreement errors sometimes arise. This mostly happens when the sentence contains two nouns with different pluralities. For example, sometimes we might say, the snake next to the elephants are. We call this agreement attraction because the local noun attracts the verb with the wrong plurality. A common finding in this literature is attraction asymmetry. It's much more likely to make an agreement error in a sentence with a singular subject and a plural noun than the other way around. In other words, we're more likely to say the snake next to the elephants are than we are to say the snakes next to the elephant is. There are different theories of attraction and agreement errors. My goal is not to go over them. The purpose of this talk is not to differentiate between these theories. But there is an important point that I want to make from our own previous work and the work of others, and that is that cognitive processes such as working memory and inhibitory control do affect the generation of agreement errors and can be accommodated within all of these theories. I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A if you're interested. Instead, the focus of this talk today is to understand how children compute subject-verb agreement. For one thing, we know that children make a lot of agreement errors. Why do they make a lot of agreement errors? There are different and sometimes contradictory pieces of evidence. For example, there are lots of studies in French looking at agreement errors in children, and the findings are mostly that children tend to default to singular forms. There is usually no evidence of agreement attraction in these studies in children before the ages 8 or 9. And even when children do exhibit agreement attraction, they usually do not exhibit attraction asymmetry. In more recent studies, using paradigms that have a little bit more ecological validity in this age group, especially in the preschoolers, we see different patterns. For example, Lorimer and colleagues conducted a study in English-speaking preschoolers, and what they had was a memorization game. Children watched some scenes, memorized some events, and then produced sentences such as, the baby with the blocks is on the bed. In this study, the authors found a qualitative pattern of attraction and attraction asymmetry in children. But there were two things that were strange. First, they did not test for the statistical significance of these effects within the child group. Instead, they statistically tested differences between children and adults' patterns of agreement attraction and found significant differences there. However, these differences stemmed from the fact that the adult group in that study did not exhibit attraction asymmetry. And as I said, this is very atypical of findings in this literature. So we have mixed patterns of agreement errors in children, and we still want to know, why do children make agreement errors? There are two main hypotheses. One is that they make so many agreement errors because they don't know better. Maybe children haven't yet mastered the rules of subject-verb agreement in English. There are some reasons to believe that this could be true. For example, Lorimer and colleagues presented a really beautiful corpus analysis showing that preschoolers are rarely exposed to sentences with complex NPs. So if direct exposure to such structures is necessary, then we might think that children just don't know how to compute agreements in such sentences. A prediction here is that if children don't really have adult-like knowledge about subject-verb agreement, we can expect them to make qualitatively different patterns of errors compared to adults. So the findings such as frequent defaulting to singular, no attraction, or no attraction asymmetry would fit very well within the impoverished knowledge account. A second possibility is that children actually do have adult-like knowledge about how subject-verb agreement works, but in real time, they are not always able to apply that knowledge appropriately. And this is where the point that I made earlier becomes important. If we really believe that cognitive processes such as working memory and inhibitory control play an important role in subject-verb agreement computations, then we do know that these processes are impaired in children or not yet matured, and so we might expect children to fail at applying them to computations regarding subject-verb agreement. This account would make a very different prediction. So we now expect qualitatively similar error patterns between children and adults, we just expect children to make many, many more errors than adults. So this is what we wanted to test in this study. It was really important to us to use a paradigm that ensure us that children really understood the purpose of the structures that are using instead of just trying to imitate a structure that they were told they have to use. So they play a game. It's a referential communication game that I'm going to show you in a second, and they produce sentences with complex NPs at the service of a communicative goal. There's no repetition of someone else's utterance, there's no writing, and there's no memorization. Here's how the task works. The child sits in front of a computer and sees a screen. An experimenter sits opposite the child and has sheets of paper with the same kinds of objects that the child is looking at on the screen. The child is instructed to give instructions to the experimenter on how to color animals on their screen. So this is how a typical trial works. On the child's screen, an object starts flashing. The child is told that that is the object that the child has to describe to the experimenter. We call this a target object. So basically the sentence has to be, the bird is red. However, there's always more than one bird. So the child learns that in order to disambiguate their utterance, they have to use the animal next to the target animal. We call this the cue animal. So children naturally say something like, the bird next to the brown snake is red. And then the experimenter colors that animal and shows their sheet to the child for feedback. Children as young as 5 years of age can do this paradigm pretty well, and they really enjoy playing this game because they like giving instructions to adults. Another good thing about this paradigm is that you can create 4 types of sentences that we want to look at in agreement attraction. Sentences with plural subject, singular local noun, as well as the other 3 possible types. This basic version of the task allows us to look at error patterns that children make when they are producing these kinds of sentences at the service of a communicative goal. But you can also add manipulations of cognitive demands to this paradigm. We basically create a second condition, which I call the cue flash condition. This is how it works. Remember in the previous version, I told you that the animal that flashes is the target animal. This is a natural tendency of a child, that the animal that flashes would be the subject of the sentence. We now test a different group of children and we teach them that the animal that flashes is actually not the target, instead it's the cue animal. Now the child has to describe the animal next to it. So if the snake flashes here, the utterance would be exactly the same as I showed you before. The utterance is still, the bird next to the brown snake is red. I call this the Gleitman effect because Lila Gleitman and her colleagues showed that visually cued objects create a strong tendency in speakers to use the cued object as the subject of the sentence. So now that what the child has to do is to remember not to do this. This places a working memory burden on them, and also to inhibit the urge of using the visually cued object as the subject of the sentence. So this condition has high working memory and inhibitory control demands. Now we can see how the pattern of agreement attraction from the baseline condition changes as a function of increasing demands. Here are the results. On the top row, I'm showing you results from 54 adults who completed this paradigm. And on the bottom row, you see 54 children, 3 dropouts who did 32 trials of this task. As you can see, the age breakdown underneath that graph. The first finding, children make about 10 times more agreement errors as adults. Second finding, there is no evidence in this paradigm that children are defaulting to the singular form, at least in English. You can look at this by comparing SS versus PP sentences, and you see that children's errors are comparable. If anything, adults show more evidence of defaulting to the singular form in this paradigm. The next finding, adults show a robust agreement attraction effect, SP and PS sentences more than SS and PP, but so do children. We, in fact, after group analysis, just took the 5-year-olds, that's our youngest group, and did a post-hoc analysis on them, and they themselves even show robust agreement attraction. The next finding is that when you increase the demand, adults show greater attraction asymmetry. What I mean by that is that the difference between SP and SS, which is bigger than PS compared to PP, gets larger when working memory and inhibitory control demands increase. But you could see the exact same pattern in children. So again, there is no difference. There is just one difference that we see here between the pattern of adults and children, and that's about attraction asymmetry in the baseline low demand condition. Adults do show this, children do not, even though numerically it's there. So we were curious about why that is. The reason seemed to be because our 5-year-olds made quite a few errors comparatively in the SS condition. In other words, they use the plural form here. This is interesting. It seems that when there are 2 nouns in a sentence, children seem to want to use the plural form. So conclusions from the experiment 1 is that impoverished knowledge account, we did not really find a lot of evidence for this, except for that one piece of evidence in 5-year-olds in the SS sentences. For the processing limitation account, on the other hand, we find quite a bit of support. In fact, the patterns of errors seem to be very similar between adults and children, as well as when that pattern changes when the demand increases. In experiment 2, we wanted to replicate the findings, the basic findings of experiment 1, and also specifically test for the robustness of attraction asymmetry in the baseline condition. Remember, at the group level, this was not significant in experiment 2 in children, but it was in adults. So we took out the 5-year-olds who did seem to have the knowledge, impoverished knowledge problem. And this time we looked at 6 to 8-year-olds in the baseline condition in the same paradigm that I showed you. Sample size was calculated using the effect size from experiment 1. This time we see robust agreement attraction as we did before, and we also see a robust attraction asymmetry within the group. So conclusions. Overall, we see very similar patterns of agreement errors between children and adults, even though children make quantitatively a lot more errors than adults. This brings up the importance of using a task that elicits agreement production for a communicative purpose in children, as opposed to having them repeat structures, may have to memorize instead of really generating that structures for the purpose of communicating a message. Our pattern generally rules out the impoverished knowledge account with the exception of subject-verb agreement, and this is not necessarily tied to sentences with complex NPs. The general pattern of the data instead supports the processing limitation account. Both children's and adults' rate of agreement errors increased with increased processing demands, but the pattern was similar to begin with and stayed similar as a function of this increase. So the general takeaway message that I think we should take from these data is that children as young as 5 years of age do have adult-like mechanisms for subject-verb agreement computation, and maybe also for other morphosyntactic computations. I would like to thank Akira, who was really monumental in launching this project, my 2 students, Jessa Saul and Mike Freund, who helped a lot with the designing of the task, collection of the data, and coding of the data, as well as NSF and linguistics panels who have continuously supported this work. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Bonnie. So I think we can take questions now if we have any questions from speakers in the room or attendees in the room or from online.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. You said that the kids in this paradigm learned that they had to provide that disambiguating information about the target, so they had to provide the cue information. Can you hear me? Even closer. Okay.
Sorry, the internet connection is really bad. I just hear like bits and pieces. If
Okay.
somebody could type what you're saying, that would be fabulous.
I've got my face right next to the mic now.
I can do live transcription into Zoom.
That's maybe.
Thank you.
Maybe I should do that in general. What I was asking is how long did it take the kids to figure out that they had to provide information on the cue to disambiguate the target? We've had some difficulty with children of this age figuring out how much they need to say to disambiguate for a listener, and so I was surprised how well your paradigm works. It seems like a great paradigm. I'm just wondering if it took them a few trials to figure it out or a long time.
Oh, I see. So if I understood correctly, you were asking about did we get children to the point to understand how to use these disambiguations? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So we walk children through an orientation phase that is really tailored to the child. So we start with very, very simple aspects of the task. So we first, for example, show them just one animal that is colored, and we teach them how to say what the color of that animal is. Then we add 2 more animals. And so it's a very, very kind of step-by-step procedure. Some kids, in fact, don't get it. So in fact, when we started this with 4-year-olds, we just realized that 4-year-olds don't get this. So it's really tailored to the child's special kind of configuration and needs, but usually most of our children, within 5 minutes, get how the task works with this very stepwise procedure.
And do you have any trials where they don't need to provide additional information? So we're also interested in efficient communication in children of that age. So I'm wondering if they get in a kind of over-specifying, over-describing loop, or whether they...
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's great. We did not have that. The reason was because children are also impatient, and we wanted to have at least 8 trials of each of the sentence types, SPS, SPP, and PS. And the task already took 30 minutes with orientation and everything. So we did not have filler sentences where they did not have to provide any information about the cues. But that's a really good point.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Do we have any questions from Zoom?
No, we don't.
Okay, great. And I actually had one question on this. So since you mentioned that many of the earlier results were in French and that this had several differences, do you think that using this paradigm with French-speaking children would produce similar, do you think these findings would replicate for children speaking French as well, just off the top of your head?
Well, yeah, I thought a lot about this. Even if I think we equate everything, I think the results are going to be different because French doesn't have as clear of a cue marking of singular and plural as does English. So it makes sense for French-speaking children to learn this a bit later. So I don't think that those results are, a fluke or just because of the kind of paradigms. I really do think that there are differences between French-speaking and English-speaking children in this regard.
Right. So you might expect to see the same pattern, but at a later age, for example, or
yes,
yeah,
yes, exactly.
Great. Okay. Well, let's thank the speaker again.